Hey everybody, welcome back. Here's a treat for you. Back in '96, when I worked for the BBC Horizon programme, which is a science programme on the BBC, they made a film called Masters of the Ionosphere, directed by the wonderful Nathan Williams, also edited by a friend of mine, Nick Fellows, and even sound recorded by another friend of mine, Michael Danks. I didn't work on Masters of the Ionosphere, I wish I had, but it covers all the military history of HAARP in Alaska. It looks at nuclear bomb tests in the atmosphere, and it just explores the whole subject of the patents and the applications for heating our planet. Unfortunately, it's a very low-res copy. I don't have a broadcast quality original, but Masters of the Ionosphere is truly a good film. But I think you will enjoy it anyway, because it explores all the points about HAARP and ionospheric heating that we have been discussing here on this channel. So here today is a treat from the archive, Masters of the Ionosphere.
Life on Earth would not exist without protection from its own sun. Although we are millions of miles away, its violent surface throws out enough radiation to kill. But between us and this storm of energy lies a shield, the ionosphere. Normally unseen above us, it is revealed in the ghostly movements of the northern lights, buckling and twisting under this solar onslaught. For the past 100 years, there has been a handful of men driven by a desire to control and manipulate it. Now, at last, they may have succeeded. Deep in the heart of Alaska, there is a mystery. Hidden away from the glare of publicity, the US military is building a machine that they hope will allow them to control the environment.
It seemed like a futuristic, horrible thing that somebody could do to the environment.
I was amazed because this experiment succeeded beyond our imagination.
HAARP represents really a universal tool. It's like a hammer.
The boundary between science fiction and science comes when can you actually make the thing that you're proposing.
In a project that sounds almost like science fiction, the Pentagon has constructed giant antennae designed to beam energy into the upper atmosphere, the ionosphere. Their aim is to control the extraordinary magnetic properties of that invisible world above our heads. To harness the very winds and storms that flow directly from the sun. Turbulence on the surface of the sun winds up magnetic forces strong enough to tear matter free of its gravity and blast it out across the solar system. This is the solar wind. The Earth is not helpless in the face of these gales. The magnetosphere, our own magnetic field, is constantly distorted by the solar wind. Nevertheless, it repels most of the charged matter. But energy such as X-rays and ultraviolet light pass through untouched. When these meet the outer atmosphere, they collide with atoms of air. This creates a layer of charged particles around the Earth, the ionosphere. This soup of electrons and ions is known as a plasma. It is volatile and unpredictable. Driven by the sun, its movements are quite unlike the air we're used to, as can be seen in the aurora borealis. In this century, technology has become vulnerable to magnetic storms in the ionosphere. Radio, power transmission, and satellites all have to accept its influence. But there have always been scientists who have tried to exploit its properties rather than just endure them. The first man to dream of mastering the ionosphere was Nikola Tesla. Born in Croatia, he emigrated to America in 1884 to live in New York. Today, he's primarily remembered for inventing alternating current and is commemorated in his favorite local park.
You might call him the father of alternating current. He is the person who invented the induction motor and the method of transmitting electricity over long distances through high-tension wires. It really did change the whole face of the world.
With the fame this earned him, he became a prophet of the new age of electricity, selling the public his grand vision of the future.
Electricity was considered terribly dangerous, and he, as a showman, would show how he could hold electrical wires and not be killed on the spot. In dealing with scientists, he was not that popular because quite often he worked outside of the scientific hierarchy, and often when he had new ideas, he spoke to the popular press rather than speaking to the scientific journals.
There will be a tension of 1 million volts between them.
His extravagant predictions about everything from death rays to communication with other planets alienated his scientific colleagues. However, today, people are more forgiving.
Science fiction and science fact are sometimes separated by a small edge. And I really don't believe he was science fiction oriented. I think he knew the physics, he knew there was a reasonable chance something could be done. And he, as I understand it, he spent his money to build a facility on Long Island to test his ideas.
In 1901, Tesla started to build a huge tower at Wardenclyffe on Long Island. Despite his populist ideas, his success with alternating current convinced even the most hard-headed financiers he was worth backing. In particular, he persuaded one, J.P. Morgan, that his tower could send and receive wireless signals.
J.P. Morgan wanted to get the London Stock Exchange closing prices before anybody else had so that he could make investments on the American side. Tesla said that was relatively easy to do with this tower, so he provided considerable financial support for it. Tesla, in his own mind, thought that was too simple, that he wanted to do something 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more complicated.
For months, he kept his real intentions secret. He hoped to exploit a conducting layer in the atmosphere, even though at the time there was no evidence it existed. His grand scheme was for hundreds of towers to beam energy through the air, supplying power to countless machines. With his limited knowledge of the ionosphere, he believed it could be used to carry all this energy. He even suggested an artificial defense field around America, like an Edwardian Star Wars, protecting the nation's ramparts.
His original idea of Wardenclyffe Tower was to make a demonstration of wireless transmission of power, which he intended to send from Long Island to Paris to light the Paris Exposition.
Thousands of dollars were spent on his tower, but wireless energy transmission defeated him. He never lit up any bulbs in Paris. And then Marconi succeeded in sending the first wireless signals across the Atlantic, working with equipment a fraction of the cost. Tesla was forced to reveal his grand scheme, and his financiers deserted him. Never again did Tesla have the financial backing for his wild schemes. The Wizard of Wardenclyffe died 30 years later in obscurity, but his ideas live on.
Tesla was an ingenious person and had very wild ideas, some of them that came to fruition. I mean, the patents of Tesla are unbelievable in number and in ingenuity.
In particular, the idea of actively using the ionosphere survives. Now, with late 20th century technology, the the US military are realizing at least part of Tesla's dream.
I think Tesla would be very proud.
Like delicate experiments.
He made possible a lot of things that were only theoretical before.
Ironically, it was Tesla's rival, Marconi, who first showed how to exploit the ionosphere. Long-wave radio was only able to cross the Atlantic because of a plasma mirror in the sky. The ionosphere reflected radio waves, allowing them to bounce round the Earth's curved surface. Over the next few decades, this introduced everyone to the volatile nature of our magnetic environment, as they listened to their radio reception varying from day to night. The ionosphere was the subject of intense research, and in the 50s attracted another scientist who dreamed of mastering the plasma, Nikolas Christopoulos.
Christopoulos was a Greek engineer, a genius, very similar to Tesla in a lot of ways. He was thinking big, wide, new ideas. His education, again, was just finished the Polytechnic School of Athens, and he was an elevator engineer in New York. And he came with some of the most important inventions between 1950 and 60.
He looked at big problems and thought of, big ways to solve them. He was an exciting person to know. And when I met him, just about anything he proposed, the Defense Department would try.
An explosion of research led by rocket technology allowed scientists to study the magnetic environment above our heads. In 1957, new layers outside the ionosphere, more than 1,000 kilometers from Earth, were discovered by a colleague of Christopoulos, James Van Allen.
We were surprised to find that in addition to cosmic rays, we had an enormously greater intensity of electrically charged particles trapped in the Earth's magnetic field.
At last, scientists were reaching out to the environment beyond our atmosphere. These layers of radiation were called the Van Allen belts, and they made their discoverer a household name. But it was the height of the Cold War, and even as he celebrated, there were those who had suspicions.
There was a very considerable doubt as to whether what I'd been measuring was actually natural, that is, occurred in nature without any artificial means, or whether it had been produced by Soviet nuclear bombs.
A strategic tussle started over the ionosphere. As a consequence, there was pressure on military scientists to keep up in the space race, and this fueled some of Christophoulos' wildest ideas.
It was Greek scientist Christopoulos who had working in America, who had become rather aggrieved at the Soviet success with Sputnik, and wanted to encourage the Defense Department to make a display of American interest in the global environment.
The big experiment which he proposed to the military back in 1958 was the Argus experiment.
Carried out in complete secrecy, Christophoulos' idea for exploiting the ionosphere was simple: explode a nuclear bomb up there. For Van Allen, this was the grandest scientific experiment of all time. But the project was backed by the military, who had a more practical interest in the ionosphere.
The two military motivations were first to disrupt the properties of the ionosphere as a medium for transmission of messages, radio messages, and secondly, possibly to create a barrier which could, of very high energy particles, which would disable or disrupt the guidance system on ballistic missiles.
Argus was a scientific success, But to control the ionosphere, the military knew they'd have to explode more powerful bombs. In a massive operation mounted in the Pacific, they prepared to test nuclear weapons on land, air, and sea. In particular, there was to be a series of high-level explosions over Johnson Island. Euphemistically called the rainbow bombs, these tests were widely publicized.
I don't think there was a great deal of public alarm. It was during the period of the Cold War, the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles and the threats of attack from the Soviet Union. And I think it was considered to be a reasonable and perhaps important part of that preparation.
In fact, public opinion about such grand environmental experiments was already changing.
Ever since this rainbow bomb was first announced, controversy has been growing between the scientists over the effect that it may have. Will it, or won't it, upset the Earth's radiation by disturbing the so-called Van Allen radiation belt?
I remember the summer of 1962 as being a very anxious time. I mean, after all, we did not have access to the precise explosion which Americans tended to make. We did not know the altitude, and we could only assume that they knew what they were doing. And many of us were worried that it was going to be a really sledgehammer blow at the Earth's environment.
Well, he puts it in a very sinister sense, which I don't think is appropriate. It is true that they are primarily military weapons effects tests. However, they're done by exceedingly competent people who are well known to those of us in the States.
I'm very surprised that anybody, even Professor Van Allen, can be certain of the effects which are going to be produced. I don't see that this can possibly be so, because we don't even know where the particles come from.
That was, in some sense, a legitimate apprehension, but a lot of us who have been working on the subject for several years had pretty well described the expected effects and knew that they were not anything like that catastrophic.
American scientists claim that our worries were unfounded and the effects would be purely local and not of lasting significance.
I think so far as damaging the universe, I have no feeling of guilt on that score. I think it'll be much more illuminating.
The explosion started in July 1962. The military launched 3 bombs. The largest was Starfish at 1.4 megatons, enough to turn night into day on the island below. Three further launches were unsuccessful. One rocket exploded on the launch pad, destroying both missile and its nuclear warhead. There was extensive contamination of the surrounding area. Still, the successful test showed the range of artificial magnetic effects that could be created by nuclear weapons.
The Starfish burst, of course, is about 1,000 times the power of the previous Argus burst. It produced a correspondingly larger effect on the ionosphere. Durable effect lasting a fraction of a day. It knocked out the power system in Hawaii by virtue of the magnetic storm it created.
While a huge electromagnetic pulse had put out the lights in Hawaii, the islanders experienced a vivid artificial aurora.
I think the magnitude of the magnetic storm was a bit of a surprise, but otherwise it worked pretty much as we expected.
In fact, they turned out to be completely wrong. Fission products moved out into space. At the same time, the explosion, of course, disrupted the ionosphere, caused severe interference with long-distance communication, and incidentally destroyed the solar cells of a British satellite Ariel and put it out of action.
Yes, well, there were several satellites who suffered radiation damage and were put out of commission. That was, of course, one of the tests that the military people were interested in, is finding out if that was possible.
On all counts, Operation Dominic proved to be a significant milestone.
in the ever-vigilant task of keeping the nation's ramparts secure.
The following year, the Limited Test Ban Treaty stopped all high-level nuclear tests.
On the one hand, I'd love to see more tests out of the Argus type, not the Starfish type. They're too large for my taste, but I'd love to see a further selected tests of that nature made, and they're totally harmless and would be very interesting scientifically.
The military had learned how to mess up the ionosphere, but was still no nearer mastering it, and soon its strategic importance was to wane. By the mid-60s, geostationary satellites had become a reality. Shortwave communication could pass untouched through the ionosphere, and man-made satellites provided the mirrors to reflect information around the globe. Many people believed the unpredictable ionosphere was yesterday's problem. Nick Christophilus was not one of them. His inventive mind had come up with another way of using the unique properties of the ionosphere. The most feared weapon of the Cold War was the nuclear submarine. They could remain submerged for months, but while down there they were deaf to normal radio messages because the signals couldn't penetrate water. Christophilus came up with a grand solution.
He developed a project called Sanguine, in which they were going to lay over a good portion of the state of Wisconsin wires about 8 inches under the ground and use those basically to make low-frequency waves for communication with submarines. They're called ELF waves.
ELF waves could bounce around the Earth trapped below the ionosphere, but penetrating deep underwater. Although they could not carry much information, they could reach submarines at any depth. The problem was, you needed an antenna thousands of kilometers long on land to generate ELF, and this was not a popular idea.
We have voiced our opposition to Project ELF.
If you push us into simple disobedience, then so be it.
And that you're willing to predicate your security on a willingness to destroy the planet.
By the time the Navy tried to build this huge antenna, there was considerable antagonism towards grand military schemes. There were fears about the health and environmental effects of generating these extra-long waves. Despite government reports saying they had no more effect on the body than power lines, the anti-ELF campaign blocked military plans for almost a decade.
It was a political issue. Congress would not pass such an enormous antenna. So they made it smaller and smaller and tried to make it more efficient. They did a lot of surveys. They found some ground that would give better results.
The Navy finally got its ELF antenna, but it was a shadow of the original plans. It did not become operational until 1988 and only has limited capabilities for communicating with submarines. Nick Christophilus died in 1972 and never saw his ELF antenna built. But his ideas and dreams were picked up by a colleague, Dennis Papadopoulos, who saw another way of solving the Navy's problem.
Although I knew that Nick's idea was very sound and feasible, I thought that it was politically impossible. And so I was looking for alternatives. And one of the things that came to me is that these waves propagate by bouncing between the Earth and the ionosphere. If instead of putting the antenna on the ground, I could put it in the ionosphere, then I didn't have any political or geopolitical problems and no environmental issues.
But where, in the chaotic plasma of the ionosphere, was there a structure that could be used as an antenna? In the land of ice and snow, Papadopoulos found what he was looking for. On the borders of the Arctic, the northern lights hang in the night sky. To the indigenous people, their power has long been a source of fable.
My grandmother used to tell me a story about the Northern Lights. She told me that if I were to be outside and I whistled, the Northern Lights would come swooping down, chop my head off, and the spirits of people that had departed would use my head as a kind of a soccer ball.
Even for the scientists who study this ghostly phenomenon, it never loses its mystery.
I have spent 30 years studying the Northern Lights, and they're still as intriguing to me today as when I first came to Alaska. They're always changing. Movements in the sky and the colors and the shapes they form. It's sort of like watching clouds on a summer's day and imagining different animals in the clouds.
The aurora is a visible manifestation of the magnetic tussle between the Earth and the Sun. Our protective magnetosphere has holes on the north and south pole where the magnetic field lines bunch together. As the solar wind buffets and streams past, energetic particles cascade down these holes, creating a multicolored ring as they hit the ionosphere. This is the aurora. These lights only represent a tiny proportion of the energy being released. The flow of the solar wind creates a huge electric potential.
It results in a gigantic electrical current flowing parallel to the surface of the Earth, somewhat in the same region with this hanging curtain of lights, but sometimes a little larger. That we call an electrojet. It amounts to thousands of amperes of electrical current.
This was the structure that Dennis Papadopoulos was looking for. He suggested that the electrojet could be used like a giant virtual antenna, generating the ELF waves needed to communicate with submarines. But this was only theory.
When it went outside the laboratory towards the Navy was hoping that they would have the antenna that Nick had proposed in one form or another. So any alternative will endanger that idea. So they didn't want to proceed with that. And the issue was closed at the time.
Papadopoulos was frustrated by the Navy's rejection. But elsewhere, scientists continue to develop a range of techniques for researching the ionosphere. One device in particular was useful, the ionospheric heater. These machines beamed shortwave radiation directly into the ionosphere, deliberately heating up a patch of plasma.
What it is analogous to, almost directly, is a microwave oven heating system. The heating agent is the electromagnetic wave. The electromagnetic wave itself is not hot. It generates heat simply by causing motion in the material that it interacts with. And the motion sets up a friction force, as I've said. And that is what generates the heat. So it's simply like taking the electrons and the neutrals, rubbing them together, rubbing two matches together, if you like, in the upper atmosphere, and that generates heat.
In the early 80s in Scandinavia, they showed you could fine-tune the ionosphere with this technology.
One of the experiments they tried was to modulate the heater with music from a hi-fi system. I think, in fact, the first experiment they used the Ride of the Valkyries. So they transmitted these signals on the heater up to the electrojet, and the electrojet responded and retransmitted these acoustic frequencies back directly to the ground. So it was as if the electrojet was acting like a huge vocal cord.
At last, a way of harnessing the volatile ionosphere. The heater was an interesting research tool, but the military were not convinced it had any practical use. Instead, it was left to an oil company to suggest a defense role for heaters. On the inhospitable northern slopes of Alaska, Atlantic Richfield Company, ARCO, had a problem with billions of cubic meters of spare gas. After investigating more obvious ways of using it, they called in a consultant plasma physicist, Ben Eastland.
ARCO had a problem of what to do with the natural gas on the North Slope. It was too expensive to build a pipeline down to the United States. They had hired me to think of a non-chemical approach to the use of the gas. The first idea that came to mind was to make radio waves. Because I had all that energy, I could make a lot of radio waves. Second idea was it's located in Alaska, which is near where the Earth's magnetic field, where the magnetic pole is. And the third idea was I knew that Soviet missiles could come over the pole. And I added one piece of physics, which would be the ability of those waves, when they hit the upper regions of the magnetic field, to make 50 billion degree electrons. The way these electrons would kill a missile is if they hit it, they would bury themselves in it. And if enough buried themselves, they could explode it, mess up the electronics, do many bad things to a missile. I came up with a big antenna, big enough to basically fill the Van Allen belts with energetic particles. And the initial thought was to make a complete shield that would put those electrons in all of the paths missiles might be able to take and destroy all of them.
Eastland's concept made the military sit up and listen. Big ideas were back in fashion. Ronald Reagan had just shaken up military scientists with the Star Wars program. Eastland's giant ionospheric heater didn't require any expensive space technology, yet theoretically, his clouds of energetic particles were capable of shielding against nuclear attack. It appeared like a stroke of genius.
Generals or anybody would have loved the idea if it was feasible. You know, create a shield and nothing goes through. Or everything that goes through gets killed.
Up until the end of that year, I worked on the patents. And we prepared 3 very broad patents. Virtually any application we could think of, we put in the patents. Besides the global missile shield, we thought of patches of electrons that could shoot down missiles, communications jamming, generation of ELF, VLF waves.
Eastland's ideas were only theory, and someone had to check them out. One scientist was well known for his expertise in the area.
We brought in some excellent people, one of them being Dennis Papadopoulos. He had a lot of experience on ELF, on acceleration of waves, and he actually played a key role in verifying, theoretically, that those hot electrons could be made.
But to Papadopoulos, there was a big difference between creating hot electrons and pumping up a huge defensive shield.
What I discovered is that there were not only physics problems with that. I mean, namely, it was impossible to use the acceleration mechanism that he wanted, physically. But even if you could do it, you needed the world electricity for a year to really get that energy. So it was wild.
Within a day after the patent was issued, the first patent, the New York Times called and wanted to interview me. I provided them an interview, and I think maybe ARCO got a little upset about that. And with this big antenna and everything, that may have played a role in my not staying with the operation. One of the reasons given to me was that my ideas were too far out, but they were far out from the beginning, and what part of far out do they want to work on?
Try to change Ben's ideas to something completely different. And in the end, I was successful, thank God.
The military developed a renewed interest in the ionosphere. ARCO, through a subsidiary company, and without Ben Eastland, managed to land a contract in Alaska to build the world's largest ionospheric heater. Dennis Papadopoulos was chief scientist.
I think the time was right. We have done a lot of ionospheric work over the years. There were many ionospheric heaters in Tromsø, in the Soviet Union, in Arecibo. So we have learned basic physics of that. So what we wanted to do now, extrapolate, build a more powerful heater, which could do a lot of practical things.
The High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP.
As far as I know, What they are trying to do here is shoot a radio wave straight up into the ionosphere and sort of like makes a ripple, like if you were throwing a rock into a pond. And then once the beam is turned off, then the ionosphere just goes back to its normal self. From what I understand, it's about a third as big as it's actually going to be upon completion. So we should have something like 33 acres and about 150 antennas or something like that.
HAARP is nothing more than a series of radio transmitters. There are small antennas, and there are many, many of them. And they send radio waves like the AM radio. They interact with the electrons which are in the ionosphere. They shake them back and forth, and they make them hot. And when they make them hot, they modify the properties of that medium to all electromagnetic waves. Now, we've learned how to modify it in such a way as to perform particular tasks.
After years of heater research and decades of studying the ionosphere, HAARP represents state-of-the-art heater technology.
HAARP is different from the previous radio probes of the atmosphere in that many of them have just been high-power bulk heating experiments, whereas HAARP is fine-tuning and trying to work with what already exists in the ionosphere and then manipulate it slightly.
This instrument can change frequency, it can change where it's directed, it can change how it's focusing. It's got much flexibility, which allows it to do all the different kinds of applications.
To scientists, HAARP may be impressive, but to many locals, it's just another military project messing with their environment.
If anybody has any misgivings about the project, I think mostly it's probably just due to distrust of government. We live in a sparsely populated area, and Alaska is a place that people come to because they want to get away and they want to be on their own and they want to live their own life the way it is. And so anytime you have a large project backed by the military, I'm sure there's some people that get a little bit suspicious.
What they were really looking to do is perturb the ionosphere, which is the upper layer of the atmosphere that protects us humans, living organisms, from incoming cosmic radiations. And the idea that they would be pumping it up with huge amounts of energy and disturbing it in a way for an experiment. And this is the shield that protects us naturally from things that otherwise are quite damaging.
Put in print that it is a military project.
I think that's kind of
I started reading Bernard Eastland's patents. Even though I didn't understand them, I just started looking into them. I grew up with the ethic of Mother Earth, Father Sky, and when I heard about the possibility of the military intruding in the ionosphere, I felt that it was something happening to me individually. One of the patents discussed raising a section of the ionosphere, and it was like doing a lobotomy, and I related to it in that way.
I mean, waves like the waves that HAARP has, we have them all the time. These waves are created by the nature, are created by lightning. They're constantly around. And the waves we're going to create are going to be more coherent, so we can detect them easier. But in terms of power or intensity, it will be a very, very small fraction of what the natural environment has.
To prove HAARP was harmless, the military commissioned an environmental report. But just like the ELF protesters in the 80s, the anti-HAARP group didn't trust government reassurances.
The military has a history of experimentation, and even if there's collateral damage with its own citizens, and we can look at the nuclear atmospheric testing and testing in Nevada in the 40s and 50s, where the record has now shown that they were aware that this produced health risk, but they went ahead anyway.
After 25 years, Papadopoulos at last got to generate his ELF waves. This time he was interested in their ability to penetrate the ground and distinguish features hundreds of meters beneath the surface.
The military has been developing over several years a ground-penetrating radar. That has not been very successful because it can only go to about a depth of a couple of meters. By going to lower frequency, we get higher penetrating capability, and then we can really much deeper.
Mostly clear in the Fairbanks, Alaska area. High 25 below in town. That's right, below zero.
The target he chose to image was under the nearby town of Fairbanks.
There was an experiment in which there was a particular old mine which was about 30 meters underground, and we were trying to see whether we could really image it.
HAARP made the electrojet generate ELF waves. Sensors in Fairbanks picked up the waves as they returned from deep under the ground, and after interpretation, they clearly revealed the old mining tunnel 30 meters below the surface.
This was really the first test of the concept in the world, and I was actually amazed because usually a first experiment always fails. This experiment succeeded beyond our imagination. It is a fantastic remote sensing tool. I can do remote sensing of the ionosphere, of the ground, of the underground, of the seas. I can measure the temperature of the water. I think, dreams that I've dreamt for the last, 25 years are becoming reality.
HAARP has so far cost $58 million. And the arrival of such a high-tech military project has meant more money for related scientific research in the area. But suspicion of the military is not just confined to non-scientists.
Civilian scientists look a little askance at these, wondering what are all the reasons that the military is interested in. And the ones that are pretty clear that we're interested in and it looks like it's something we can work with, we're pretty happy to do that. But I must admit, everybody who gets involved with a military project sometimes is a little reticent, thinking there might be a black or a darker purpose.
HAARP is supported by new research that suggests it may not be that unnatural. A lightning bolt appears to act just like an ionospheric heater. Filmed from above, thunderstorms show fleeting flashes of light reaching upwards. They have been dubbed sprites.
Sprites is a wonderful phenomenon discovered very, very recently, in which there are domes of light jumping up and down at about 17 kilometers. When you have big thunderstorms, lightning acts like antenna. So it modifies the ionosphere exactly the same way that HAARP modifies it, except with more power.
Huge bursts of short-wave radiation from the lightning bolts thrust energy from the thunderstorm, a couple of kilometers off the ground, into the ionosphere, 70 kilometers above.
We are already having something like 1 million HAARPs operating constantly in terms of lightning. We have 1 million lightning discharges and 1 HAARP. So the energy that the lightning discharges puts there, it's 1 million times, or probably even more, than HAARP. So, how can it affect?
But HAARP will never get an easy ride from protesters. For buried in its history is a bizarre suggestion for the ultimate in environmental control. Ben Eastland was encouraged by his lawyer to put every possible application in his patents. With his giant antenna, he believed it would be possible to alter the world's weather.
You can steer this antenna horizontal to the ground, and many of the jet streams would kink and come over Alaska. I thought by imparting momentum, say on the edge of the jet stream or on the edge of a circulating pattern of clouds, that you could steer it or modify it. Learn something about how to modify the weather. Right now, the world's at the mercy of the jet stream going wherever it wants to go. And I thought it might be useful to be able to control it. Studying the weather is okay for a scientist, but to suggest finding a way to change it is a little dangerous, because you can get laughed at for that and be considered a non-serious scientist. That was very much in my thoughts as I put that into the patent. But the fact is, I could see that there was a chance to study some of these things, and there may come a time when the Earth or the people on it need to modify the weather in some way.
The American government has created weather tampering techniques.
When if somebody had told me that that equipment even existed 10 years ago, I would have thought they were nuts, sir. And at this point in time, we have all the documents to prove it. And if you think that...
The hint that HAARP could change the weather has been seized upon by the far-right anti-government movement in America.
As bizarre as that is, I would say that weather wars are the greatest weapon ever created in the world.
We addressed the U.S. Senate in June about weather modification, mystery in Alaska called HAARP, what they're really up to change the world's weather.
Despite official denials that HAARP has any designs on the weather, local protest groups insist this is part of the military's grand scheme.
You know, we've been accused by some of being alarmists, and maybe we are, and maybe it's time to sound that alarm. You know, what we find out now, 30, 40, 50 years after the nuclear programs in the United States began, is how much risk they presented and how much damage that this generation now has to undo. So perhaps the time to sound the alarms before the project is fully engaged.
It's 100% silly, because I think Mother Nature is much more powerful than anything that mankind can come up with.
Well, you run against the usual problem of energy. It's really like having a fly trying to stop a truck. I mean, I have the energy that I have from HAARP is about 1/3 of what a hurricane has. And even if I, you know, even if I conceive any catalytic action which amplifies that strength of HAARP, it will amplify it by a factor of 2 or 3 or 5, not by a factor of 10 million. So that's the problem. It's an energy problem.
To many who oppose HAARP, what it really can or cannot do is irrelevant. It is the idea of environmental manipulation that they find objectionable. But these antennae are the product of a century of ionospheric research. Having got this far, the military are determined not to lose their chance to master the ionosphere.